As someone who is an avid reader, sometimes I find it fun and fascinating to look at what other people also read. It's good to find out what other writers read too, and I came across a poet named Rainer Maria Rilke's, probably mispronouncing this person's name, who lived in the 20th century. He was a Catholic. He was a famous poet and theologian. I had truthfully not really heard of him, but his poems were thick and full of anxiety, alienation, spiritual loneliness in Europe, even prior to the Shoah. And you can feel that he's haunted by divine absence. He describes that as a thin wall that he names, which, by the way, between us and God, where the absence is hiding. I point this out because I don't think this is in fact an old fear. I think this is a continuous human experience. The fear that we have all wondered, struggled with, and even doubted, where is God? Specifically, this one verse still sits with me. You, God, who live next door, if at times through the long night I trouble you with my urgent knocking, this is why I hear your breath so seldom. And I can kind of imagine Rilke begging, knocking, wanting, yearning, even in the dead of night, even when he's most fearful, waiting and listening to hear a response to his knocks. And sometimes it feels as if we too ourselves knock, and yet there's still no reply. And I bring this up because this anxiety, I think, stretches not just from the early 20th century, not just into our own lives today, but all the way back from the time of Hanukkah, where there was a question of where was God amongst all of the tumult. Most of us, of course, grew up with the image and the story of Hanukkah being this simply fun story of a miracle, an 8-day-long miracle, in fact, of oil. Hence, I like to say, fried food galore for a week, full of joy. But, as I mentioned earlier tonight, was this miracle necessary at all? Pnei Yeshua, an 18th century Polish rabbi, came up with an answer to that question. And according to Halacha, he points out something fascinating, that after the temple was rededicated, the menorah, in fact, could have been relit with any oil. Communal needs override ritual purity. There was, in fact, no danger of darkness, no risk that the menorah would go unlit. They had the capacity to use an already open jar and light it. So if the Jews didn't need pure oil, what was the miracle for? Pnei Yeshua answers, the miracle is not about the oil. It's about divine presence. It's about a response to the knocking. After years of war, destruction, and terror, if you recall your history, after fighting not only for survival, but to remain and possess a distinct Jewish character as a people, they were exhausted. They were traumatized. They were spiritually battered. And in that moment, they wanted to feel God. Not a removed God, not a distant God. A God who was there, a God who acknowledged the danger that they had gone through and endured. So that miracle was celebrating that God was in fact with them. That flame was saying, I'm here. It wasn't saying, though, some untrue words and saying that God was here. It wasn't saying that you're not always going to be safe forever. It wasn't saying that your enemies are going to be forever vanquished or some such thing. And it wasn't saying that you're never going to feel alone. Simply the presence of the flame was that God was there. And being present matters. Because I think today, again, not like during the time of Hanukkah when there was tremendous infighting, though you could argue that, whenever you have two Jews, you have three opinions, there's always going to be some level of infighting. Come on, it's who we are. But today, I think more so than other times, we live in a moment where there's fear again. Existential fear. Fear of growing anti-Semitism, fear of having a place in the world that doesn't seem quite as welcoming. Fear that not only will God be silent, our neighbors will be silent. Our neighbors who are ideologically on the right, ideologically on the left, and ideologically in the middle won't come. We are watching ancient accusations resurface in new language. We are seeing Jews reduced to symbols, to stereotypes, to moral caricatures across the media and across social media, across the internet. And we're told sometimes subtly, sometimes more brutally and in our faith, that our suffering is illegitimate and our peoplehood suspect and our story expendable. And what is so painful about this moment is not only the hatred itself that many of us have anxiety around, it is the attempt to make us doubt our own moral standing, to suggest that Jewish existence is a problem that needs to be solved. Look no further than the conversation that Tucker Carlson had for so many hours with a human being. This is not a political crisis alone, though I'm suggesting that it's a theological struggle. Because at its core, anti-Semitism is an erasure. It denies Jewish particularity. It tells us that our story should dissolve into someone else's universal vision, that our survival is an inconvenient truth, and that our pain is, just not worthy of even being recognized. We see this again in light of everything that happened in Australia, not just in the targeting of our brothers and sisters, but in the aftermath of what was said about them. And what was said about the gentleman who stood up to protect them. Those messages say, you're not welcome to exist openly as yourself. And I want to suggest that Hanukkah stands against that. Our menorah flaming beautifully outside in our courtyard says, no, I don't think so. The crisis that gave rise to Hanukkah, I want to be very accurate about it, wasn't simply a battle between faithful and secularist Jews. Nor was it a battle between Jews versus Greeks. It emerged, in fact, if you remember from our Torah study or Kiddush Club, out of intense Jewish infighting between Jews who embraced Hellenism, Jews who colluded with the Seleucids, Jews who were unwilling to bend and hear other perspectives, and a Seleucid empire that was bound and determined to enter a conflict by squashing anybody and everybody that stood up to them in any way, shape, or form. The Seleucid Empire, when they first came in, though, weren't about abolishing Judaism. They wanted to impose strict order. Violence, though, escalated in response to their stricture when imperial power moved from managing internal disputes to enforcing cultural conformity, and what ultimately declared incompatible with imperial order. Private belief, but public covenantal life was seen to threaten imperial power. Shabbos, circumcision, Torah, embodied practices that in and of themselves that define in many ways who we are, were forbidden. Jewish particularity itself became a political problem to be crushed, and resistance followed. And in that struggle, God's response was not triumphant, not power over. Rather, it was intimate. It was a flame, a sign, a whisper. It was a whisper to Rilke's knock. In my own theological work, I have argued that Judaism has always known something profound, that God does not hover over us, untouched by history, far removed. Rather, God suffers with us. Isaiah teaches, in all their affliction, God was afflicted. The rabbis imagined God weeping in hidden chambers in the Talmud, walking in the Garden of Eden, sitting beside us on the roadside. And Hanukkah, of course, belongs deeply in that theology. The menorah in embodied theology is not proof of God's power over us. Rather, it's evidence of God's companionship with us. When we light our Hanukkah in public, by a window, by a doorway, in our courtyard, we're not proclaiming everything's fine. We're declaring something brave. We're saying when the world is hostile, when the wall feels thin and fragile between us and God, when we struggle simply to even hear God's voice, we can still tell our story. We can still name ourselves. We will insist that Jewish life is worthy of light. When we lit those candles outside this evening, we were doing what Jews have done always in dark times. We were answering silence with presence. We were answering fear with faith. We were refusing erasure, and we are saying to God, to the world, and to ourselves, we are here as we always have been. May the lights outside remind us that even when deliverance is delayed, even when we feel as if we can't find God or feel God nearby, companionship is still there. May those flames strengthen within us against our own despair at the challenges we face ahead. May they be, once again, God's quiet sign that the wall between us and God is thin, so thin, that divine love still passes through. Shabbat Shalom, Chag Hanukkah Sameach.